I think by far one of the biggest things that's led me to disconnect from the broader socialist movement, or like the implications of the American left as a whole, besides the fact that generally it's pointless, like there there's not really a goal to reach towards when the entire mechanism of a state is so large organizationally that it's inherently going to get corrupted. I've frequently um, told the story of the um, corruption of when Khrushchev came to power in the USSR, in former USSR, the way that the whole system was basically upended by this military coup, and it completely subverted who was in control of the country. Um, for as many problems as the early period of the country had, there was more democratic power in the hands of the people than there was after Khrushchev came to power. Um, and he could do that because the military was there. He could do that because the mechanisms of the state allowed bureaucrats to exert power over the population, that they had a position that was more powerful than the position the people had. All they had to do was take it. Um, and so, like, even though I can look at stuff like what Robert Thurston, the historian Robert Thurston, had wrote on the early period of the country, where there was what I would define as one of the most grassroots, directly democratic movements we've seen in certainly any existing state. Um, that the strength of that democracy was not enough to hold the country. It wasn't after Stalin's death allowed to continue existing, because regardless of however many experiments are made at the local level to increase democratic functions. For example, one of the key things that was an element of their system was the fact that the workers decided who the candidates were on the ballot. The workers' cooperatives, which were also democratically controlled, would come together, decide who would run for the Communist Party, and then the vote was basically just a yes or no finalizing process on the candidate that they had already choose. And it was kind of like centralized worker councils, the way that they were doing things, and the workers themselves had the authority to recall the elected Soviets at any time, which is incredibly democratic, way more democratic than anything the United States or liberal democracies had. But but all this power that the people had was ultimately upended by the burgeoning bureaucracy that existed in the country. Did they have better social safety nets than any of the Western countries? Yeah, I mean, I'd rather live there if I was alive at the time. But, and I mean, especially if, like, I was a black person, oh yeah, I'd way rather live in the USSR. But, like, it doesn't change the fact that what they developed into was ultimately technocratic and authoritarian. I mean, there were already authoritarian problems in the early stages of the country, no doubt, but at least they had that, they had on some level that form of democratic control where the people who were members of the party were majority workers, and the people who were who formed the majority of the party in the Khrushchev era onward were more and more like these technocratic artisans and intellectuals, making the system more intelligentsia focused than focused on the majority. They lost touch with the masses, and this was a very bad thing. And I don't call myself a Marxist, but as an honest observer of history, I have to give the countries credit where credit's due and be able to weigh, how they changed and what they were in the past against one another. Keeping all of that in mind, there's certainly been a large amount of disillusionment I've had with the idea of any organized system. Because every time socialism has been tried, it's developed into some form of techno-authoritarianism, more and more away from the democratic institutions it sought to establish in its beginning. That's a problem. That would be a problem for me if I lived there, you know? So I don't think states can work. I think states are a problem. States, the hierarchy that states allows, gives people the kind of power that no one person deserves, no group of people deserves. It's too fucking big to be able to be ran consistently and good. And with this crucial context in mind, considering why I don't really care about this political stuff anymore, I also take into account the fact that basically everyone, maybe not everyone, but most people who consider themselves radically or marginally on the left being the basically anything to the left of European social democracy, that's left wing. Anything to the left of that is left wing, which we basically don't have any of in the United States. People who are either marginally or radically on the left, I think most of them started out as liberals. You know, the kind of center-right, Democratic Party, physically conservative, but just extremely socially liberal, is against the Second Amendment and all this other stuff. A lot of them started from that, liberal tradition. One of the things that I consistently see thrown at liberals but not at conservatives is the amount of pretentiousness that's in the movement. Now, conservatives are very authoritarian. They like to micromanage people's lives, but that's not really the same kind of arrogance as pretentiousness. Liberals, because of their opposition to who they're up against, like to present themselves as if they're the smartest person in the room. There's an emphasis on using certain kinds of words that are larger than you might see in order to confuse the opponent. So they'll have to look it up, kind of psychological warfare to make them feel bad for being a working class person who doesn't have time to read all day the way that these middle class liberals do. Or, attempting to belittle them with again, psychological tactics, trying to find little thought worms to get in their head to just bother somebody. And I think, the two best examples of this, both liberals, are Vaush and Destiny. They're incredibly arrogant, pretentious people. They're constantly using the scapegoat or the excuse of morality, whatever that means, in order to make their opponent in a debate be treated like a child, have them be treated like a child. The way that they present people, the way that they insult people is truly nasty stuff. It's as if the reason that they're debating is to make their opponent look bad on a public stage rather than genuinely engage with that person's ideas. In order to change someone's mind, you have to have a degree of humility. You have to be willing to change your mind yourself. An honest actor in a debate, someone who's acting in good faith, does not immediately dismiss all of the points the other side has to make as inherently immoral. That's not really a very good place to argue from. It's going to be quite difficult to convince your opponent of your views, or at the very least make them understand them, when you, from the beginning, have said, that everything that they believe is morally reprehensible and that they're stupid. Maybe this is a radical idea, but I'd like to think that the world is a little bit more complicated than that. I was just a little pretentious there myself, but it's okay, because I'm fighting fire with fire. As if anyone was going to watch this video in the first place. um, so that's my problem with liberals, is that it seems like they don't really truly care about people. It feels like they care about being right. They want to be right and be perceived as right. It's all about owning people online. That phrase I've continually used in these videos where I've tried to explain my politics is that one of the reasons I've become so disinterested in political discussion as a whole is that it's primarily just animalistic fighting. It's in order to it's to try to make your opponent look bad on a public stage. That's all it's about. It's not about advancing movements. It's not about improving anything, because largely the people don't have the power to do so. All battles in the world of ideas are simply that, ideas, not things that make coherent changes in our everyday reality. Outside of talking about something like social issues, which is incredibly malleable in the public eye, in the public consciousness. Talking about economic issues and scrutinizing one another over historical facts or perceived historical inaccuracies is ultimately going to be it's going to be a bit of a game. It's placating to one side over the other and trying to see how you can make your opponent look as weak or bad or unfit to be in the quote-unquote movement, etc. These are all very social terms, group-oriented terms, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. How can I placate to my side? How can I make the partisans on my end of the spectrum feel the most satisfied with my words? But words, in and of themselves, have not shown to be very effective in the material battle. The, the we can talk all day about these things, but talking about them's not really going to do much. And organizing doesn't seem to be doing much either. It's all kind of hopeless. The refusal to acknowledge this isn't really my problem. It's more so the decorum with which this refusal is presented, which is, as I said, infantilizing, disrespectful, and pretentious. Leftists, modern day leftists, I think many of them do this less as compared to liberals. But that American liberal Democratic Party tradition, I think, is within the minds of many of these people still, because that's where they started out. In order to get moved to the left, they had to be considered on the left in the American context, which again, remember, neoliberal center-right politics with some socially progressive ideas is considered left-wing. That's what left-wing is believed to be in the United States, even though it's not. So if they're already perceiving themselves as such, the idea of becoming more radical is not that radical of an idea. It's more like the logical extension of what they're already thinking, at least to many of them as they're learning and discovering more and more of these ideas. But that person who they were politically never really fades away. It's always kind of there. And so as a result of that person remaining a part of them, because ultimately you can't unlive those experiences, I see this kind of pretentiousness pop up all over the radical left, or just the left in general. That kind of decorum, that disdain for the average person. And I mean, I'm no one to to scoff at disdain for the average person. I talk about normies all the time on my channel and my problems with them, but I don't claim to be representing the average person while doing so. It's incredibly hypocritical. You know, in a way, that pretentiousness is authoritarian, like what a lot of the conservatives do. It's just authoritarian in the way of, I'm smarter than you, so please take my correct ideas, not, I'm morally superior to you, so I'm going to micromanage every behavior and thought and activity you engage in. Two sides of the same coin. Both political traditions, the epoch that many of these people on either side emerge from, are deeply, deeply arrogant. And it's all tied to partisanism. The obsession, the willingness to do everything you can to placate to your side. That's all it is. When the truth of the matter is that there are things we can learn from nearly every side. Elements of every side of the political spectrum that could form things that perhaps at the local level or in small experiments work very well. I don't believe in the idea of organized statehood at the large scale being able to be successful, but I think there's a lot of different things we could try from each side that, in the incredibly complicated multipolar world that we live in, be useful. And so you always have to be considering these different strings of context. So, ultimately, I guess the point of this video, what I was trying to get to, is that evidence, you can't just believe things for the sake of believing them. Every belief that you have should be completely nonpartisan, in the sense that the reason you came to that conclusion was because of the evidence you had been exposed to up to that point, and the constant willingness you have to not placate to partisan actors, but to be questioning that evidence that you've already accrued and be searching for more and more of it. You have to listen to both sides to be able to do that, in order to remove your subjective bias from the information you're consuming, and to view it from the lens of a objective third party. You kind of have to be willing to consume everything. And I think the more that you do that, at least in my case, with the information I've been exposed to so far, you begin to realize that this world is so complicated that there really are no easy answers. And it's a stark realization to make, especially when you forge so much of your political identity around partisanism in the first place. But it's helped me, I would like to think, become more humble and have a stronger inclination towards listening to people who, at one point or another, I may have insulted because of the liberal tradition that I came from, and the liberal conditioning that every day I'm trying to get rid of, because all it is unhelpful, pretentious, and uninviting. Things that I want to be none of, at least in this context.